From their interests clashing every single time there's a big fight coming up for Jon Jones, to the UFC president's unpredictable reaction to the MMA star's last fight. Here's why Dana White hates Jon Jones. If I'm being honest, the rivalry between the two isn't as wild as some of Jones' other rivalries, with some controversial fighters. But I gotta say, there are definitely a couple of situations that fueled this rivalry, like the fact that Dana White escalates the feud every single time Jones is up for a huge fight. And if you caught on, you'll know I'm talking about the time when White entertained the idea of a bout between boxing's Tyson Fury and UFC star Jon Jones. And if it wasn't obvious enough, it was in response to Joe Rogan's comments, where he claimed Jones was gonna overpower Fury in a fight. Obviously, that's pretty debatable, but it created all the hype around the fight. Meanwhile, the Gypsy King claimed he was gonna remain unbeatable. Whether it's boxing, UFC, or literally anything else, no one was gonna score a win with him in the ring. And that's when Jones pointed out that White needs to get involved if they were gonna make this fight happen. And even White confirmed that he's serious about making this a reality. But clearly, it's pretty obvious that's not happening anytime soon. And while there might be other instances that triggered the rivalry between Jones and White, this definitely seems to be one of the times when things got a little too intense. You see, the UFC fighter has almost always had a rocky relationship with his UFC boss, and there are a bunch of things that annoyed White, starting with the failed drug test. That's right after Jones failed a drug test, White was super frustrated and went on to cancel the fight with Daniel Cormier at UFC 200. Sure, that's an expected response to the situation, but trust me when I say White was pissed, and he didn't even want to talk about it anymore, and that wasn't even the end of it. We all know how many times Jones got himself into a legal mess, and I'm even talking about DUI, and sure, the UFC doesn't really seem to care all that much about these issues, as long as they don't interfere with his ability to fight. But when it comes to Jones, it doesn't take a lot for White's anger to shoot through the roof, and saying that Jones is the baddest dude on the planet isn't gonna hide how intense things can be between the two. I mean, take the Francis Ngannou fight for example. Jones has been battling with White over a potential fight against Ngannou for ages now, but he had one simple condition. Jones wanted a bigger slice of the pie if he wanted to make the fight happen. And if it wasn't obvious already, White grabbed onto the first opportunity to shut it down, only to bring it up later when he was trying to sign a deal with the Cameroonian star. That's right, he offered Ngannou an $8 million deal to fight Jones, only for the former UFC heavyweight champion to turn his back, vacate his belt, and head on to the free agency. Speaking of which, Jones was up against Cyril Gane in the ring after Ngannou's UFC exit, gearing up to win the belt with a brutal victory. And now that he's got the title, he's back to the Fury debate, hoping to make the fight happen. But only time will tell whether White's gonna let that happen. Because if I'm being honest, there have been a bunch of controversial moments between the two that fans can't seem to get over. For one, the UFC 151 cancellation faced a lot of criticism. You see, back in 2012, Jones straight up refused to fight Chael Sonnen, who by the way had stepped in at the very last minute to replace the injured Dan Henderson. Obviously, the fight never happened, and that's exactly why UFC 151 was canceled. At the same time, White criticized Jones for making everyone involved lose huge loads of money, and that wasn't the only time he did that. Fast forward to a few years down the line, and Jones was gearing up for a classic match against Alexander Gustafsson in UFC 232, which was set to happen in Las Vegas. But then, with a 6 days notice, the event was moved to California, all because Jones tested positive for a trace amount of a banned substance. Clearly, fans and other fighters raised a lot of concerns over the relocation and use of drugs, especially considering fighter safety. Moving on after the fight with Alexander, Jones was set to fight Daniel Cormier, but had to face suspension this time after he failed his drug test. I gotta say, it didn't take long before Jones made a comeback to fight Daniel and win, but the chaos didn't end there. Jones was later stripped of his victory and suspended another time thanks to another drug testing violation, only to return to the UFC in 2018. And it's not just about drugs. In UFC 235, Jones was disqualified in his fight against Matt Hamill for using all kinds of illegal moves. But while we're talking about Jones in 2018, I think we can all agree. Ever since then, he's been in excellent form and super consistent. I mean, as long as he doesn't fail another drug test. Am I right? But even outside the octagon, Jones doesn't have the best reputation. I mean, take the strip club incident, for instance. Back in 2019, Jones was charged with battery right after he allegedly assaulted a woman at the strip club in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He then pleaded no contest to a reduced charge of disorderly conduct for the incident. And even though he's one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time, incidents like these, topped with his failed drug tests and suspensions, have really fueled White's anger and criticism, which is probably what led to the Twitter wars as well. In February 2021, Jones took to Twitter to troll fans about his contract with the UFC, kickstarting a back-and-forth war between him and White, only to later accuse the UFC president of hating him and asking to be cut from the promotion, all because the talks to fight Francis Ngannou reached nowhere. Not to mention, Jones and Ngannou already engaged in an escalating war of words on Twitter back in May 2020 that even fanned the flames of the idea that the light heavyweight kingpin could move up to heavyweight. But even after all that, White could never finalize a deal, although he offered an $8 million deal to Ngannou right before the former UFC heavyweight champion became a free agent, crushing down any possibility left of a fight between him and Jones. But now it seems like the newly crowned UFC heavyweight champ is going to retire from the octagon, especially after his Madison Square Garden clash with Stipe Miocic that everyone's waiting for. That's right, Jones knows the end is near. With the Stipe fight set for the end of the year, there's a slight possibility that you might even see a showdown with the rising heavyweight, Sergey Pavlovich. Because right before the 2-week promotional tour in Australia, the MMA legend confirmed that the next fight is gonna be his last. And I think more than the fact that he's gonna step out for good, fans are disappointed that they might never see the biggest bout against Ngannou. I mean, there's no doubt that Jones is the MMA GOAT, even though it was topped off with a bunch of controversial moments, from doping suspensions all the way to legal troubles outside the octagon. And every single time he had White questioning whether the star had wasted his talent with all the controversies. But as the end of Jones' career comes near, White's reaction to the news was pretty surprising, because it seems like the two are now on talking terms again, which isn't usually what White does after the legends exit the UFC for good. But it turns out, Jones confirmed that even though he'd only communicated with Hunter Campbell for a long time, he's finally got a better relationship with Dana. And that's after a legacy the world will remember. Sure, he only fought 6 times in the last 6 years, but the win over Cyril Gane earned him over $3 million, topped with a share of the PPV revenue, adding the heavyweight championship belt to his list of accolades. And even though he can easily go on to fight into his late 30s, Jones simply doesn't see that happening. That said, he's super excited for his last fight against Stipe, even though he admitted a Francis Ngannou fight would have been the biggest priority right now. But I guess he's got the UFC president to blame for that not happening, which definitely strikes a nerve. So there you have it. From the UFC president's unpredictable reaction to the MMA star's last fight, to their interests clashing every single time there's a big fight coming up for Jon Jones. That was everything on why Dana White hates Jon Jones.